Okay, ladies and gentlemen, first may I congratulate you all on the endurance which has brought you to Saturday afternoon, which is a new slot for this discussion, for resisting the temptations of skiing for what I'm absolutely sure will be a much more entertaining experience. Possibly even a cheerful one, which will be the first time for many years. I've come to think of this, that we journalists like to think about what is the mood of Davos, and I've come to think of this as the sigh of relief Davos. This is the first time I've been here since January 2007, which does seem an incredibly long time ago, when the dominant question, at least among those of us following economics and finance, was what catastrophe was going to happen. The dominant question is not what catastrophe is about to happen in the next few weeks. There is a sense of calm here and in markets. I have to tell you also, though, that those are precisely the times when I personally get most frightened. But that is the time, and that allows us, I think, to think a bit more about where we're headed, what are the policy challenges, if we are durably to get out of the mess at least the developed countries have been in. That will be the focus of our discussion. Where are we? What are the risks of what Madame Lagarde has called relapse? What are the risks of complacency? We'll focus on the high-income countries and the emerging countries. We're going to look at finance. We've got a very distinguished panel which will be able to cover all these issues. Let me introduce them very, very briefly in order, because you will know nearly all of them. Immediately to my left is Christine Lagarde, Managing Director of the International Monetary Fund. To her left is Mark Carney, Governor of the Bank of Canada, for the moment. I'm not going to discuss any future positions Mr. Carney, Dr. Carney may soon hold. To his left, we'll come to that later. To his left is Mr. Akira Amari, Minister of Economic Revitalization from Japan, who has, I think, an extraordinary story to tell us about what seems almost a policy revolution in Japan. To his left is Gurría, who is, of course, Secretary General of the Organization for Economic Cooperation and Development. To his left, Mr. Yi Gang, who's Deputy Governor of the People's Bank of China. And finally, to his left is Trevor, Minister of National Planning of South Africa, a central player in economic policy making in South Africa ever since the birth of democracy in that country. Where are we? I'm going to be posing in a very short while a set of questions which to elicit answers on the where are we, should we be going. We'll have a discussion, and then there will be questions from the audience. I'd like to notify you now that we have agreed a revolutionary step, that we are going to look for questions, at least initially, from the non-journalists. So I'm going to guarantee assassination by my colleagues as I depart. Where are we? We know that ever since the crisis hit, we've been living in an economically divided world. My favorite simple statistic on this is since 2007, the economies of the developed countries in aggregate have effectively not grown at all. So it's been, between 2007 and 2012, complete stagnation. The emerging markets in aggregate have grown 30%, and China has grown 60% in a period of 5 years, 2007 to 2012. This really is a divided world. And if you look at the IMF's latest forecasts, which include actually a small downgrade, they clearly expect this to continue. This is the dominant theme. They expect The Eurozone to decline in GDP this year, as it did last year. They expect very low growth in the US, about 2%. Meanwhile, emerging markets expected to grow at about 5.5% this year. China by over 8%. There are some countries like India that are underperforming, but that is the picture they continue to tell. So whatever the relief may be, it's clearly not in anything like a picture that indicates strong, vigorous recovery. And when recovery growth is so weak, indeed in the Eurozone declining, can we really hope to believe that the crisis is all over? Isn't there an extraordinary political and economic risks associated with continuing decline in many countries, high unemployment, high youth unemployment, which Angela Merkel stressed here? So that's the background, I think, for our discussions. So let me start, if I may, with you, Christine Lagarde. What do you see as the really big policy challenges to be addressed, and how big a danger is complacency because of what I referred to as the sigh of relief mood that is clearly around now?
Well, thank you very much, Martin. It's nice of you to have quoted me with the risk of relapse. I would pursue that with the do not relax principle. And you have very well commented on the World Economic Outlook that we just published. I would underline a couple of factors. One is that forecast, which gives really numbers of a very fragile and timid recovery for 2013, is predicated on the Eurozone leaders on the one hand, the United States of America authorities on the other hand, and the Japanese authorities to actually make the right decisions. And that's what I mean by do not relax, because some good policy decisions have been made in various corners of the world, sometimes at the last hour in the United States, sometimes laboriously and confusingly in the euro area. But decisions have been made, including by central bankers who sometimes just came to the rescue of political leaders who were taking a bit of time to fix issues. In 2013, they have to keep up. They have to keep the momentum. What does that mean for the euro area? It means that those tools that are in the toolbox have to be operational. Doesn't necessarily mean that they have to be used if it's not necessary, but their operationability has to be confirmed. It means that the movement that the euro partners have started to consolidate their business model, so to speak, has to be furthered. It means going further on the banking union. European Common Supervisor is one step, but going further is necessary, and that includes probably difficult decisions on the guarantee deposit. That includes difficult decisions on the resolution of bank system. Further in terms of fiscal union as well, and that obviously include the necessary structural reforms that were alluded to by Chancellor Merkel in terms of improving what I know you don't like me to use, Martin, but which I will use for the purpose of this discussion, the competitiveness of the Eurozone. What does that mean for the United States of America, where growth has certainly picked up a bit better despite circumstances, and where there has been fiscal consolidation, contrary to what is generally assumed? It means continuing that movement at a reasonable pace, not too fast, not too brutally, and also indicating very promptly what will be the future of the discussion on debt, and more importantly, what will be the medium-term plan to reduce deficit and to change the debt trajectory. The same principle, in our view, applies to Japan, which has made clearly some important policy decisions, which I'm sure the Minister will comment on. And we are very interested by those policies. We certainly would like them to be complemented, just as in the United States, with a mid-term plan that includes how the debt will be reduced going forward, which is clearly an important component of the policy measures set that have been announced by that part of the world. Final point, Martin, what it means for the emerging market and low-income countries, it means when they have the fiscal space to do that, rebuilding the buffers that they have used during the crisis, which has protected them in many ways from the financial crisis through which the advanced economies have gone through. And for some of those emerging market economies, particularly in China, rebalancing the business model to go towards a more domestically oriented and certainly more consumption oriented within that domestic environment, rather than being more investment domestically and certainly less export driven for rebalancing purposes.
Thank you very much. It's certainly a formidable agenda. We all know the difficulties in these individual cases. I'm going to turn to you, Mark Carney. What I didn't mention in the opening, but I thought I could leave it to now, is the obvious fact that a very large part, perhaps the dominant part, I think the overwhelming part of why we are in this relief mode is this sheer scale of the promises and interventions made by central banks. And everybody will point out the role that the ECB has played in the last year. I mean, it's extraordinary commitments, and it seems some people think to have won the war without actually having had to fire a shot, rather a nerve-wracking sort of position. What we're seeing in Japan suggests that monetary, and in the US to some degree too, that monetary policy, if anything, is becoming more expansionary in the last year or right now. So are we getting anywhere near the end of these extraordinary monetary policies we're seeing in the major central banks? And what's next?
That's the question?
That's the
okay.
question.
I'm going to ignore that question, Martin, and I'm just going to plow on with what I was going to say anyways. No, I'll get to that. But
this was the question you were supposed to answer. You're just being a very, very clever central banker.
Well, watch. Just watch. Okay, I got here on Thursday midday, and at that point the discussion was that the tail risks had been reduced. Sometime by last evening, that became the tail risks have been eliminated. And that explains the back half of this auditorium being empty, because those are the people. I mean, thank you for showing up, because you're obviously the people who still think there are some tail risks out there. And there are. And Christine has just outlined some of the fundamental measures that are necessary to fully eliminate these. And so it's not just about central bank action. Central bank action, absolutely important. The OMTs, particularly, well, the LTROs and then the OMTs, other measures by the ECB, crucial but not decisive. And I think that's one of the core points I'd like to make, which is that these were reinforced by measures on the national level, both on the fiscal side within Europe and on the structural side. Clearly, neither of those agendas are anywhere close to being finished. And also on the institutional side. And as Christine just started to outline, we're still in early days of banking union. The other aspects of refounding European monetary union, and this process is going to take years. So, and ultimately, it's the combination of those three which have reduced the tail risks in Europe, and ultimately will set the seeds for proper growth. And you have a similar situation in the United States, where the extraordinary actions of the Fed have been crucial but not absolutely decisive. And there will need to be these medium-term structural measures, not just for fiscal consolidation, but also for aspects such as housing finance, other aspects of the U.S. economy to get there. That's my first point. So my second point, which is related to that, which is that I think people should be very cautious about ascribing to something that has been ascribed to. I actually didn't hear him say this, but apparently Larry Summers used the framework of a global stability put for central banks, being given by central banks, which and he's using that as a framework. He's not saying this is absolutely true, but that takes the tail risk off. Again, that is not correct. In my opinion, there is not an ability of central banks to take all these risks out or set the seeds for a sustainable recovery. Third point, challenges for 2013, but I'd make it the next couple of years from a monetary and fiscal policy or financial sector policy perspective, and there are other issues to be done. Monetary, I mean, for both of these, it's to finish the job that has been importantly started. For monetary policy, it's to ensure that for the major economies, they achieve escape velocity. And that is part of what, and I obviously do not speak for the Federal Reserve. I don't even speak for the U.S. Treasury, which isn't represented here, which wouldn't speak for the Federal Reserve. But the extent to which the Fed has used threshold-based guidance, state contingent guidance, part of the point of that, in my opinion, is to ensure that as the economy gains traction, within the context of price stability, but as it gains traction, that stimulus is continued to be provided entirely appropriately to ensure that the U.S. economy achieves escape velocity, which matters greatly for us. Very quickly, on financial reform, the next 2 years will be decisive in finishing the job both on Basel capital and liquidity, crucially on too big to fail, making that a reality, ending too big to fail, rather. And then finally, and most important, I shouldn't say most importantly, but equally importantly, is the sort of forgotten bit of reform, which is addressing shadow banking, over-the-counter derivatives. These are the areas that absolutely amplified the last crisis and will do so again unless we complete our agenda there. Thanks.
Thank you very much. And obviously, I take, and the audience is expected must take, your very firm warning that the central banks are not able to remove tail risk from the system on their own, and have in fact not done so, but have, to the extent that it has occurred as a result of other policy changes. That brings us actually very, very nicely to the discussion of the policy revolution that seems to be occurring in Japan in recent weeks. I was taught this morning a new word in English, which is Abenomics, to describe the revolution in monetary, fiscal, and other policies designed to end, I suppose, what many of us think of as the 2 lost decades in Japan. Though, by the way, I should point out that Japan's performance has been signally better than that of the developed countries since our crisis, but that's another matter. Minister Amari, would you explain what exactly Japan is doing and how this is going to change everything?
First, I'd like to speak in Japanese. Perhaps you could wear your headset. Of course, it's not necessary if you understand my Japanese.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Ready?
Ladies and gentlemen, I'm very much honored to be able to represent Prime Minister Abe, who is unfortunately unable to come. And I am very privileged to be here. In the Abe cabinet, I'm in charge of macroeconomic policies and growth strategies and take the lead there. Therefore, today, I'd like to present to you the concept of Japanese economic policies, which we are calling Abenomics. The Abe administration attaches highest priority to exiting from prolonged deflation, and the deflation started as long as 15 years and accompanied by the appreciation of the yen and the revitalization economy. A clear commitment to pro-growth policy has been appreciated by the financial markets so that the share prices have begun to recover. The distinctive feature of Abenomics is to develop and implement a three-pronged strategy consisting of bold monetary policy, flexible fiscal policy, and growth strategy that would encourage private sector investment. By implementing these measures simultaneously, we will aim for reversing the long-lasting trend of shrinking economy and revitalizing a sustained economic growth with more jobs and higher incomes. As a first concrete step, we adopted the emergency economic measures for the revitalization of the Japanese economy on January the 11th. In accordance with these measures, we will implement public works for accelerating the post-quake reconstruction and strengthening the nation's infrastructure to improve disaster prevention and mitigation. In addition, we will also adopt measures that should contribute to sustained growth through promoting business investment and innovation and strengthening human capital development. We expect the emergency measures would boost real-term GDP by around 2%. The government and the Bank of Japan announced the joint statement on overcoming deflation and achieving sustainable economic growth on January the 22nd. The Bank of Japan set the price stability target at 2% in terms of the year-on-year rate of change in the consumer price index. The government expects the Bank of Japan to implement aggressive monetary easing to achieve this target at the earliest possible time. Over the mid and long term, we will take measures to strengthen the competitiveness of the Japanese economy to overcome energy constraints and enhance the innovative platform based on a well-defined growth strategy, while at the same time accelerating the removal of domestic institutional obstacles, including regulations. The past growth strategies tended to fail to raise growth because business investment did not respond in the absence of a clear commitment from the government to the implementation of the growth strategies. Taking into account these lessons, we have strongly committed ourselves to our growth strategy, which will utilize all the available policy tools, including fiscal, regulatory, and tax measures. We plan to adopt a new growth strategy in the middle of the year, though some parts of the strategy will be front-loaded even before the finalization. With regard to external economic policies, we will facilitate the expansion of Japanese business activities in overseas markets, further promote high-level economic partnership, implement measures to secure energy and food, and encouraging tourism and internal investment. In addition, the 5th Tokyo International Conference on African Development, TICAD 5, will be held in June this year in Japan. As for the fiscal policy, we will manage the short-term fiscal policy in a timely and flexible manner, while we note the importance of firmly expressing the political will to restore the fiscal balance over the mid and long term. We also think it is necessary to stick to the current target of fiscal consolidation, which aims to cut the primary deficit of the central and local governments in half between fiscal 2010 and 2015, and to achieve fiscal surplus by fiscal 2020. And the Japanese economy, well, of course, from the new fiscal year's budget, we will start the activities towards the fiscal consolidation. The Japanese economy has been facing difficult challenges that the rest of the world has not yet experienced, such as the need to overcome deflation and to cope with a falling birth rate and aging population. Japan intends to contribute on a worldwide level by working to solve these issues ahead of the other nations and to show the prescription and to find the cure. So, Abenomics, it is, my explanation is Abenomics in a nutshell. Thank you.
Thank you very much. That raises many questions which we will certainly come back to. But I'd like to move on now to Mr. Gurría. I'd be interested in how, from your perspective, you are running an organization which looks very, very closely at what's going on in the developed world. How do you see the policy challenges, and do you feel that in the US and the Eurozone in particular, the two biggest parts, apart from Japan, which I want you to comment on as well, come to that in a moment, do you feel that they are now really on the right path? They really are recovering. On Japan, there are obviously real concerns about implications for the exchange rates, implications for fiscal stability of what they're doing. How concerned are you at the OECD about these aspects of the program that we've just heard discussed?
Well, first of all, what are we relieved about? We're relieved about the fact that we've exhausted our monetary policy room because we've used it to the hilt. That means interest rate, exchange rates, but also the QEs. We're relieved because we've used all the fiscal policy room that we had and more. And we're relieved because all the emergency measures that we have taken. The exceptional measures are finally in place. Now we want to have them more operational. But again, they're exceptional. They're emergency measures. And we are relieved also because a number of countries under clear attrition have been taking a number of structural measures that they couldn't probably have avoided simply because it was in exchange for the financial support. So it's not a very pretty picture, I have to say, what we are relieved about. In fact, we should be very worried because the lack of room for some of the more traditional tools is gone, and we are left with very few of these tools. Now, what are we thinking if we've gone out of these tools, the traditional tools? What do we do now? We say, well, we're saying go structural, we're saying go social, we're saying go green. Why structural? Because education, innovation, competition, regulation, the questions of territorial development and distribution, labor market flexibility, product market flexibility, the tax structures, the R&D issues, the health systems, the infrastructure, the aging challenges, the women, the girls, etc. These are the issues that we have to focus on now if they're going to keep, the growth going medium and long term. We say go social because there's still too many victims of the crisis. Just in the OECD, 15 million people who were not unemployed before are unemployed today, roughly half in the United States and half in the rest of the OECD, mostly in Europe. In Europe, unemployment is still rising, approaching 12% on average in the euro area. In the United States, stubbornly hovering around the 8%. No relief from that and no reasonable source of relief. It should not be. We take youth unemployment, double or triple those numbers. So again, nothing to write home about. Long-term unemployment, people disconnecting from the labor markets. So and problems with migration issues, problems with the delivery of public services precisely because of the budgetary attritions. We're saying go green because we're on a collision course with nature, because at the rate at which we're going, we're going to have a 4-degree by 2030, maybe a 5-6 degree by the end of the century. So we're talking about improbable scenarios, but we're on that course and have not done very much about it. The water, the biodiversity, the air, the waste, these things continue to be challenges. And also, if I have to say so, because of the crisis, we've been distracted from the prominence that we should be giving them to them. And then there are some institutional issues that should not, that should take away a little bit of our sleep. There's the questions of transparency, democracy, governance issues, both national and international. The G8, the G20 have not been mentioned here. We have to improve the international cooperation to get these things to get home. Yesterday we were in a panel about what to do in 2013. Nobody mentioned trade. How can we not mention trade in the recipes going forward? And finally, in the case of Japan, we did mention the fact that it was very welcome that they would go for growth. But, there were the monetary policy issues was a sign of caution, had to be dealt with prudently. But that the question of agriculture, the question of TPP, the question of nuclear program, the question of putting emphasis on employment, unemployment, the question of aging, etc. And, of course, the OECD is absolutely ready to support you in that process. Thank you.
I take your remarks, which are very certainly wide-ranging, as the sort of statement which says, well, now that we're not really fearing being hanged tomorrow, we suddenly realize that there are all these incredibly large number of things we've been failing to do for years, and they're all immediately on our agenda, which is very good for international policymakers and probably fairly frightening for everybody else. I'm going to turn now to Mr. Yigang. The view from China must be very, very different. The discussion we've had is very different in its nature from the one that you must be having. The challenges in China are sustaining very rapid growth and restructuring the economy. There's a new administration. What are the challenges China's going to be meeting in the next year?
Thank you, Martin. You see, after 7 quarters of the growth rate of GDP is slowing down. Last quarter, finally, it was heading up. Last quarter, GDP growth rate was 7.9, and make the whole year, last year, growth rate is 7.8%. And looking forward for this year, I agree with IMF prediction. I think China growth rate will be about 8% this year. In terms of inflationary pressure, last year it was getting diminishing. But this year, I think some inflationary pressure will come back. So that I predict that for this year, our CPI inflation will be around 3%, maybe a little bit over 3%. And the second point I want to make is how China will achieve those growth. I think the growth of China nowadays is mainly driven by domestic demand. First, the rural and urban people's income, household income, went up quite a bit. The growth rate of income has been much higher than the growth rate of GDP. So that when people have more income, they are going to have more consumption. So if you look at the domestic market of China, and in recent years, that consumption is very robust. Second reason is that urbanization process is still going on. You know that we just passed the 50% urbanization point. So that if we look at the history of other countries' urbanization process, so we still have a long way to go. That will generate a lot of investment and make the economy continue to grow. And the third point is that we continue have the macroeconomic policy that encourage domestic consumption, encourage import. So that we want our balance of payments surplus continue to shrink as a percentage of GDP continue to getting smaller and smaller. And you know that last year our current account surplus as a percentage of GDP was about 2.8%. I think this year we are going to continue that trend. Even our trade account surplus is a little bit higher, but our current account surplus this year will continue to shrink as a percentage of GDP. That kind of balance of payments policy will continue. So our goal is basically achieve more or less balance of payments balanced. And the other point is that we emphasize environmental protection and energy efficiency so that make the growth has a higher quality. The last point I want to make is that the international environment, especially the quantitative easing monetary policy of developed country, that impact we have to continue to watch. And also looking for this year, trade is very important. So protectionism is another thing we have to concern. But overall, I think I'm pretty much in line with the prediction of IMF. Thank you.
Thank you very much. It's still very, very difficult to get used to the idea of an economy of this scale, which has had a rather poor year of growth, namely 7.8%. It's worth thinking about the implications of that. Our final speaker in this round is Trevor Manuel. Very interested in your perspective on what's going on in Africa, which has actually been really doing very well, remarkably rapid growth, little, I think, under-noticed in how well it's going. But I'd be interested in first how you see your own country and Africa more broadly, and also in that context, what you expect from the the rest of the world to continue to support that? What are the policy challenges that you feel must be met if further progress is to be delivered?
Thank you very much, Martin. Let's start with Africa. In the revised World Economic Outlook this week, the IMF anticipates 5.7% growth for the African continent. That's pretty good in the current circumstances. And in that context, it's important to recognize that our country, South Africa, is a bit of an outlier, the only country on the continent that was revised downwards by 0.2%. Yes. But Africa is incredibly strong. In fact, as we sit here now, heads of state are meeting in Addis Ababa, and amongst the issues that they're discussing are the institutions on the African continent that must be strengthened. We must deal with regional economic communities to ensure that we can support economic integration across the continent. A second strand of that, but a standalone as well, is infrastructure, ensuring that funding is there for infrastructure is a fundamentally important part of that. And then it's the relations between Africa and the rest of the world. Now, to hear that, you know, it's not often that Angel leaves me a bit disconcerted, but he's relieved about the fiscal policy measures being used. I'm worried that there appears to be a disjuncture between monetary policy that is a lot more accommodating in the North and fiscal policy, and my former colleagues, the ministers of finance, too many of them just seem like deer caught in the headlights of a car. Don't want to move. They are self-fulfilling prophecies of the fiscal cliff, self-fulfilling prophets of the need to consolidate and embark now on a program of penury. It's not going to work. I think that part of what needs to happen now is some signaling from authorities in the rich world that will assist in spending so that we can have growth. We are not going to have growth. And in the current milieu, I'm afraid deficits are going to grow in the absence of growth. So whatever else Africa may do, unless there is a different mindset in the big North, we I think, are going to remain as a hope for the future. And we need to try and unshackle the growth opportunities now. Thanks.
I'm so grateful to you for having said that, particularly, and I will now get to the questions on fiscal monetary mix. Because it's a pretty big issue, and a number of you discussed it. You can't all discuss it, but the thrust of policy clearly in the major developed world is towards fiscal tightening and, if anything, further monetary loosening. This has raised a huge debate in economics, which is also a huge debate within economic institutions, notably led by Olivier Blanchard, the very distinguished chief economist at the International Monetary Fund. So, Christine Lagarde, are you comfortable with the policy mix you're seeing in the major countries? And that leads us in a short while specifically to the changes occurring in Japan, which in a way seem to be more of that mix. Have we got this right in the US, in the Eurozone? Are they getting it now right in Japan with very aggressive monetary policies, but fiscal consolidation? Trevor, Manuel raised this question, does seem to be a pretty central one.
Thank you, very distinguished Martin.
I didn't promise you easy questions.
No, nor any title for that matter, and I don't want any. But let's just focus on the fiscal policy, because you referred to that one, and see whether, from the IMF perspective, we find it appropriate and sensible. First of all, we do believe that in advanced economies, there has to be some degree of fiscal consolidation. So from that perspective, we haven't changed, if you will. There has to be fiscal consolidation because the general structure of those economies is invariably an overburden of debt on the one hand and a crippling deficit policies that has been with them, for some of them, for a long time. Second point, we believe that fiscal policy, that fiscal consolidation has to proceed at the right pace, which doesn't mean to say that all of them have to go deep, hard, and promptly. Some countries that have the space, that have the financing flexibility, can actually go at a more reduced pace than sometimes what they have been asked to do. And I'll point to two different regions. One, the United States of America, where there has been fiscal consolidation over the last 3 or 4 years at a reasonable pace, and where we think that there should continue to be a degree of fiscal consolidation at pretty much the same pace, which is roughly one percentage point per year. In the Eurozone, as we have said repeatedly in the case of several individual countries when we were asked or when there was a program design underway by the Troika partners, we did say that it was unnecessary to go at an accelerated pace. And clearly, the suggestion that we made concerning, for instance, the timetable of Greece, where we did ask that an extra 2 years be given to that country, is an indication of that. We hold similar views in relation to a few other countries, and I will not, point the finger at any of them, but we believe that from a general perspective, within the Eurozone, the pace should not be an accelerated pace. Added to which, we believe that instead of being fixated on nominal targets, we believe that it is a much better approach to have structural targets rather than nominal, which means that the automatic stabilizers should be let to play, and that clearly the structural targets are the right measurements. Finally, to accompany those fiscal consolidation policies, we believe that accommodative monetary policy is an absolute must in order to unleash, support, and encourage growth, which must go in parallel with the degree of fiscal consolidation that I was referring to.
Can I just follow up with you, Mark Carney, on this issue? How do you see, again, we're thinking about policy options over the next year, the issues created by managing the fiscal policy mix? Clearly, fiscal monetary policy mix, clearly fiscal policy is set on a tightening path at different rates. What problems does this create for monetary policy? How do you internalize this within the monetary policy process, looking particularly at the major economies, the decisions they have to take?
Well, I think you answered your own question the way you pose it. You internalize the fiscal stance in the monetary policy mix. Monetary policy is more nimble than fiscal policy. As Christine says, there's a primacy on a paced consolidation focused on structural or cyclically adjusted deficit, progress on the cyclically adjusted deficit. That means the automatic stabilizers work. Monetary policy takes that as given and provides appropriate stimulus to achieve the price stability mandate. And that's the only way, in my view, for the coordination to happen, or that's the most effective way for the coordination to happen. So I think it's not as complicated as the question is sometimes put.
Just to follow up this on the monetary policy side, you of course delivered a speech called Guidance not so long ago, which has been widely noted, at least in my own country, in which you discuss what you would do beyond threshold guidance, which is what the Fed has been doing, as you've described, and you talked about nominal GDP targeting. Do you think those sorts of ideas are, beyond being very academically interesting, fascinating, are actually policy-relevant ideas in current circumstances in relevant developed countries?
All countries are relevant, Martin. I think a couple of things. One, I would take a slight issue with something Angel said earlier, which was that monetary policy is maxed out or has been taken to the hilt. There continue to be monetary policy options in all the major economies. Those have to be framed in the context of the mandate. The mandate is a decision of the democratic, it is a decision of the government, or in the case of the Eurozone, it's a decision of governments through the Constitution. The operational independence is paramount. That is what central bank independence is. It's operational independence in order to achieve the mandate that has been given to those institutions. So to get to your specific question, within the framework of flexible inflation targeting that exists in most of the developed economies, there remains considerable flexibility, which includes the use of communications, which includes the use of other unconventional instruments, and that in the context of a given fiscal stance can be used to achieve price stability over the right horizon, a clearly explained horizon, and that's the contribution to achieving sustainable growth.
So, Trevor, Manuel, when you've heard these replies on fiscal and monetary policy, are your worries about what's happening in the developed world assuaged?
There are certain panelists who I will watch from the 1st of July. I'm not quite sure why. But of course, operational independence is important. But the problem is that if governments aren't advised to think in the long term, then these prophecies become self-fulfilling, because the mandates that we will set for central banks will probably extend the stasis. And that, I think, is an enormous risk. It's the ability to take a longer view on how we move from where we are. And this is why I think that what we heard from Minister Amari this afternoon is fundamentally important. Because in taking a view in the context of Abenomics, they're talking also of a series of social measures. Because if we only use aggregate economic or macro measures, then we fail to really appreciate what's happening in the lives of people. And however difficult it is in Europe, there are some things that we as Africans would want. We would want Europe to hang together and to take decisions that would advance. But part of taking those decisions would also mean carefully calibrating what is happening in the lives of people, so that we don't, in abstracto, take a view of aggregate macro measures. It's trying to get these balances right, which means that we have to encourage policy making that's a lot more nuanced in the current milieu.
Minister Amari, if I may follow up with from what you said, it raises a whole host of issues, but let me just look at the two which have been very much discussed outside Japan in recent days. The first is that your new proposals amount effectively to a pretty fundamental dilution, perhaps that's the right word, of central bank independence. And that's a concerning precedent. And second criticism or concern is that here is Japan, the third largest economy in the world, pursuing what looks like a deliberate policy of driving down the exchange rate, or what is viewed as that, with potentially destabilizing effects. After all, Japan is not a deficit country. It still has a very strong external position. How would you answer those two concerns that people outside Japan feel about what you are doing?
I think you'd be better keep wearing.
Thank you, Martin. First of all, well, as regards the new proposal, you might say that it might undermine the independence of a BOJ or central bank. In case of Japan, so far, there has not been any undertakings to share the inflationary target with the central bank. This time, for the first time, we came to an agreement of 2% inflation target. It is a more or less international level. And the central bank declared that through their own efforts, try to achieve the 2% inflation stability level. And on the part of government, in order to achieve the two targets of economic growth and the fiscal consolidation, take all these measures. So both government and the Bank of Japan voluntarily take this path. BOJ will be doing this, such and such. Government of Japan will be doing such and such. So that's the purpose of the joint statement. From the international context, it is not any divergence from the international standard practice. And then, based on that, when it comes to exchange rate, you might think that it's a deliberate operation to drive down the value of the yen. Well, we in the government would refrain from referring to the exchange rate. I'm very often asked, for instance, do you think the yen is too low, or the time has come to see the change in the trend? We never respond to that. It is for the market to decide. We take policy measures. That is what's only seen in Japan, not seen elsewhere, what we have suffered for a long time. That's deflation. Well, compared to this year, next year, we'll see further decline in prices. And then people would postpone the actual purchasing activities. If the prices are much lower the year after next rather than next year, then the deflation will lead to the stagnation in consumption, and that will lead to stagnation in production, and then stagnation in wages. We had this negative chain reaction. So for the past 10-some years, the nominal growth rate remained unchanged while other countries are growing. In other words, unless we extricate ourselves from deflation, we cannot see the growth. And then to that end, the central bank would set the 2% inflation target. Then we can generate inflationary expectation. Now we have deflation and expectations, so we cannot change the atmosphere and mood in the society and economy. And the government would create real demand to fill the gap between supply and demand. So fiscal mobilization, and then that would lead and generate the private investment with government commitment. And then led by the private demand, the demand will be created. So for the past 15 years, we have suffered from deflation. So the Bank of Japan and government are now committed to take the necessary measures to achieve the exit from the deflation and to resolve the issues we should be resolving. We are the third largest economy, and we are aware of our responsibility to lead the global economy. But because of deflation, we could not fulfill our responsibility. We are trying to regain the health of the Japanese economy so we can make contribution to the world economy, and I'm sure this will be welcomed by the entire world. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Minister. Carney, I think you wanted to comment?
Yeah, say two things. One, commend Minister Amari and the government and the Bank of Japan for this commitment to end deflation. I mean, the importance of that in terms of managing expectations, achieving the end result is essential. The second point is, though, about the operation of flexible inflation targeting and what it means to have independence, operational independence of the central bank with a mandate given to it. And I'll give you three cases. Because what the responsibility of the central bank is to determine the optimal path to return to the target, taking into account issues such as Trevor has raised, volatility in output and the broader impact on the economy, and the impact on financial vulnerabilities, including global financial considerations if you are a large economy and global spillovers. So if you're in the case of my central bank, current central bank, and you're returning to inflation from below, and you have an issue, potential issue with rising household credit, you might take a little longer to get back to 2%. In other words, have policy a little tighter to lean into the wind and support macroprudential measures. If you're coming from above and you've got a fiscal consolidation, you again might take a little longer to get back, given the issues with output that Trevor was flagging. If you're coming from below, from a deflationary environment, and you have potential global spillovers of your policy, that might also factor in to your reaction function and the time period over which you seek to achieve it. But once the goal is set, the central bank needs to make that determination, and there needs to be an understanding as the goal is set of the tolerances that the central bank can operate within.
What Minister Amari has just described seems to be fully compatible with that. I'm going to just ask one final question, and then I'll go to the floor, because it's not an issue we focused on. It is an aspect of the Eurozone situation. We didn't talk about this. I'm going to ask Christine Lagarde first from the IMF, and maybe Angel Gurría wants to comment both very briefly. What concerns me at the moment particularly is that some very big countries that are under stress, Italy and Spain, big in the context of the Eurozone, of course, are suffering from really very deep and prolonged recessions, which your own forecast suggests will continue. And that seems to imply that unemployment will continue to worsen from what are already very, very high levels, with enormous social stress. The Eurozone as a whole, according to your own figures, is shrinking. And even in strong economies like Germany, growth is very, very weak. Is that a context in which we can avoid, it will be easy to avoid further political stresses, which might then rebound back on financial markets, including sovereign debt markets and banks, and then put us back essentially into crisis situations? You alluded to this in your opening statement. I know it's difficult, but it seems to me this is a very, very fragile situation. And I don't see at the moment, from what we're talking about, how this is going to change. I take everything Angel Gurría said about structural change. These are all obviously very important, but they're not going to bring relief to this. Is there the time to deal with this, given the enormous pressures we're seeing now in a number of countries?
With disclaimer that it's as Managing Director of the IMF that I'm talking about this particular matter. You are right that it's a very fragile situation. One where we forecast the zone in very, very minor recession because we readjusted our forecast to minus 0.2%, partly driven by the negative forecast for both Italy and Spain, not to mention a few others. But we forecast 2014 to be then positive, and those two countries that you alluded to be turning positive as well. It is fragile because it's prone to political crisis and communication about slow decision-making processes, step backs once step forward have been announced, which is a typical way in which the Eurozone operates and improves over time, but over time only. It is also prone to potential accidents, let's face it. We have 3 countries of the 17 members Eurozone which have a program with the IMF and the European Commission and the European Central Bank. One probably soon to come, which is Cyprus, and clearly 2 major players that have recovered significantly in terms of access to financial market and financing, Italy and Spain, one of which, the former, will be facing political election comes February. So it is not a stable landscape and a walk in the park for the year 2013, but it's a lot better than what they have had in 2012, and they have made progress. The toolbox that the European Central Bank has devised and improved is significantly stronger and better, and there are some national governments, significant ones, that are now convinced that they have to make structural progress in terms of reforms going forward, which is why I go back to my do not relax principle, because 2013 is going to be yet another year of labor and hard work to reconcile the macroeconomic framework that is necessary with the microeconomic imperatives of actually boosting growth, encouraging the private sectors to create jobs and to make sure that the social fabrics of countries in that zone are stabilized.
I'm assuming you agree with this, so...
I think, yes, that the toolbox has improved the situation, and the fundamental policies that the governments have taken are the things that has improved the situation the most, more than the exceptional measures. However, execution has not been stellar. the Greece situation, you know, we should have addressed it 3 years ago, and we balked and discussed because they used the euro, nothing wrong could happen to it. Eventually, we had to recognize that it wasn't viable. We went 2 rounds with that. In the last round, which was supposed to be the last round with a capital L, then we balked at using the collective action clauses, and therefore still an important chunk of private sector debt remains in there. And it may or may not be feasible going forward. Okay, then Spain and Italy. Both of them decided not to ask, okay? Not to ask. Now, why didn't the powers that be go out and said, it's available for you anytime you want it, for heaven's sake? You know, this is what would have given more confidence. We would have today an even further compression of spreads because the things around have been, you know, pretty good, but there's still accidents. What they can have, these are still fragile places. And we could have improved their situation. So politically, it was a very difficult situation. Some of them may have decided to actually, yes, we're ready to ask, but they were told, please don't ask. We fixed everything for you to ask, but please don't ask if you can help it. And therefore, what happens is we have a situation which is hanging a lot on the mood and on what's going on in the atmosphere, rather than the fundamentals they're working on and they were working on before. They deserved to be told, yes, we can support you if that is the requirement. So I think the execution and the use of the toolbox can be improved, and that will also improve the confidence level.
Very quickly, Martin, it's not hanging on the mood of the moment. The toolbox is a lot bigger. The European Stability Mechanism is in place and endowed with 500 billion euros. And there has been a reaffirmation of the European leaders within the Eurozone to stick together, hang in together, and shoulder the problems together. Indicative of that is clearly what the Euro partners have said to Greece: get your job done, deliver on your program, and we will support you comes what may. So I disagree with you, Angel.
Well, I'm going to leave that there. You can all make your own judgments. I'm sorry I've run out. I want to take questions. I want to take, at least initially, non-journalists. I can't see very clearly, so you'll have to put your hand up. Say who you are, ask a question, be very brief, not a speech. Please, I will cut you off. There's somebody there, whoever it is, please stand up. And well, I know who it is, I think. Yes. No, not EBRD.
Jeremy Zettelmeier from EBRD. Can I just prod you a little bit further on the last round of discussion? It seems to me we have clearly created a window of opportunity for Europe to get out of the crisis. But if you look at the instruments which Ms. Lagarde emphasized, on which we are not supposed to relax, I do not see these instruments generating growth, right? It's about, you know, adjusting fiscally at a moderate pace, and it's doing structural reforms which eventually will increase long-run growth, but not, say, in the next 2 years. So the real worry is that in this intervening period, we might get a new financial sector problem that is not the result of an overhang of the bubble until 2008, 2009. So say in a country like Italy, which did not have such an overhang, and that will basically put us back into the doldrums. So analogous to, you know, the way we responded to the last crisis, 2008, 2009, you get a fiscal problem. The way that we're responding to this crisis might get us a new problem.
I'm going to put them together. More questions? There's a gentleman over there. Yes, please.
Ishrat Hussain from Pakistan. I wanted to draw the attention of the panel to the decoupling issue. Before 2007, all of us in the developing countries felt that we were on our own self-propelling momentum of growth, and we didn't need the advanced economies. That was, for a brief period, disproved by the crisis because the contagion effect was widespread. And after a certain blip in 2007 and 2008, the trajectory for growth in the developing and emerging markets has resumed its own past behavior. Now, do you feel that the developing countries, even including Africa, which is doing 5.7%, with the stagnant Eurozone, with the 2% US, with the deflation in Japan, will be on automatic pilot with its own efforts, or will it have to continue to rely on the advanced economies?
Very good question. I'll take one final one in this round. Anybody? Gentleman here? Yes. I apologize. I'm going to go to the back. If seeing is quite difficult, please.
Jerome Peribert, still there. Talking about pace, there seems to be a huge discrepancy as to how major countries are going towards the fiscal discipline. The US doesn't seem very obsessed with their -6–7% deficit. Europe is very much focused on this. So what about the consequences of this different pace?
Okay. I'm going to start with decoupling, and I'm going to start, if I may, with Yigang and Trevor. China seems about as fully decoupled as one can imagine, in looking at its growth performance, which I gave at the beginning. And that, of course, has created a new growth pole for the whole world. Is that view correct? Does it matter at all how big a mess of their affairs the developed countries make?
I want to make 2 points. The first point is that nowadays globalization and trade and investment connections of the whole world, developing economy, is getting more and more interconnected, so that totally decoupling is impossible. And whereas China is relatively strong in domestic demand, but even that they felt greatly about the negative impact of the crisis and slowdown, so on and so forth. Second is that economy like China, whereas you do have real domestic demand, so that even you have a very adverse environment for the external, we still can maintain a certain pace of growth.
Trevor Manuel, what is your perception? Rather, your situation is obviously a bit different from that of China, a huge colossus like that.
It is very different. The issues that are applicable in Africa, I mean, there's a lot of room to boost intra-African trade. And so focusing on the institutions that matter becomes fundamentally important now. But, you know, in order to get there, financing it will require utilizing the current space, and unfortunately, it is a commodity market that will still drive Africa. Key challenge for us would be to use the proceeds of that. But, you know, it's not possible to look at decoupling. I think that we tend to be dedicated followers of fashion from time to time, and we come to Davos and we learn these new words and we repeat them, and then we realize that we weren't so smart after all. I think that what we need to understand right now is that we need an interconnected world. Why? It's in Africa's interest that Europe is well organized and recovering, for instance. We don't see a decoupled world possible in the short term.
I'm going to move on to the other issues, but just for the sake of time, the question, that, if I got it correctly, and I hope I do, is that essentially the Eurozone has no growth policy in relevant time horizons. I mean, in the very, very long term, all this might work out, but the question is how it gets through the next few years. The Chancellor Merkel talked about this, and if I understood it correctly, I may not have got it absolutely correctly. She more or less said, well, you're in a mess like this, it does take years to get back to normal, and that's just what you have to live with. And there isn't really much one can do about it, apart from generate basic stability, restore confidence, and so forth. How would your response be, Christine Lagarde, on this issue, the relatively near term?
That reminds me of a point made by Guy Ryder from the ILO. He was quoting a newspaper from Belgium way back saying, the economic situation is cured, but people will only see it in about 7 years' time. And that's not in essence exactly what she said, but Germany having gone through what it has gone through, there's a bit of that. The structural reforms take time. Angel is far more qualified than I am to comment on that. They are necessary in Europe and within the Eurozone, but they will take time to deliver results. In the meantime, tighten your belt and stay put. We have to carry on with the fiscal consolidation. What we are advocating is that there is also a focus on growth, and that was the point about the monetary policy that Mark described as a component and a subset of the fiscal consolidation, short-term, medium-term plan that must be articulated within that part of the world. Can I just make one point about the decoupling? I think it would be justice to Africa to actually mention that there are multiple different situations, depending on whether the countries have commodities, depending on whether they rely heavily on trade with Europe, and that is certainly the case for South Africa, but not necessarily the case for all African countries, and whether they rely much on remittance coming from the sort of developed part of Europe. So I think we need to be careful with the decoupling in general. Each and every country has its own set of specificities, and we need to be attentive to that, in my view.
Final question. I'm afraid it does go to you again, if somebody else wants to pick it up. The transatlantic divide, is that actually an illusion or is it a reality? Because in some sense, if I've been recently looking at the figures, everybody's tightening, though from different starting positions. And there is a very vigorous debate, my perception, is in both Europe and in the US about whether that's wise. So I don't see as much as a divide as I used to, but I'd be interested in your perception on that.
Neither do I, and I think it goes a little bit unnoticed that the US have actually consolidated significantly over the last few years, and they continue to do so. I think a lot obviously is going to depend on the sequestration and the debate that will come in a few weeks' time, but they do consolidate. They started off from a much higher point, if you will, or much lower point, depending on how you look at it, and if you compare that with the aggregate number for the Eurozone. But within that zone, you also have very, very varying degrees of consolidation. But in the main, the consolidation is pretty much progressing at the same pace, with small exceptions of those countries that have a program and that have to go faster.
Angel, Gurría, you wanted to comment on this?
Yeah, in the case of the US, I think the question is, the consolidation, yes, is taking place, but then it's quite interesting to see that we are holding our breath to see if they will walk headfirst into a well when they can walk around it, So the question of the governance and the decision-making process is really what is at stake here. And second, it requires a medium and a long-term context. Last year, President Obama proposed a 3% stimulus package to create jobs. It was worth $450 billion. But they proposed a 10-year adjustment process which suggested how it would stabilize and then drop in terms of debt to GDP. And it was against the logic because it was more deficit, inflationary pressures, what have you. But at the same time, it was addressing the key question, jobs. So people received it very well. Congress didn't pass it either, but still, it was a good idea at the time, as Steve McQueen would say. Mr. Amari and Mr. Carney did not say one thing, by the way, on the question of the yen. Let me just mention it very briefly. Brazil, Korea, Mexico, Chile, China, India, and of course, Japan are places that people choose to go to when there is uncertainty. The currency in that country then rises in a few weeks or in a few months much more than the productivity efforts that you would have made, for years and years and years and years. Therefore, there is a certain legitimacy in terms of trying to defend yourself from the onslaught. The only question is, where do you draw the line between what is self-defense, legitimate self-defense, and then something that would be a beggar thy neighbor policy vis-a-vis your other trading partners? This is a thin line, and it's a difficult line to walk. Perhaps the Japanese could get some advice from the Swiss, who were very, very competent at this.
Wonderful people, the Swiss. Mark Carney.
Sorry.
I love the disagreements.
No, but, look, one of the places people go when things get tough is Canada. And if you look at measures of safe haven flows, correlations, safe haven correlations over the last several years, it is far higher than all those other, with the exception of Japan. We are sort of co-equal in terms of those flows. And we adjust our policy. It has an effect on our policy, but it is an entirely different matter. And this is not the policy of the government. Minister has been very clear, and the Bank of Japan is clear in terms of the policy focused on a domestic inflation target, and you just walked it over in the direction of the currency. That's not the policy. And I wouldn't want everybody to go out on the ski slopes and conflate the two. There is an understanding within the G7 that has existed, and for good benefit and for the benefit of the global economy, that there is not unilateral currency intervention. That is not the policy, as just explained, and it's not the policy that will support sustainable global growth. What is the policy that will support that is appropriate monetary stimulus to achieve price stability, and as the government of Japan has just defined jointly with the Bank of Japan, price stability in exactly the same way that the Government of Canada and the Bank of Canada have defined price stability.
I'd love to have more questions, but I think I have to bring it to a close. Because it ends at 15:15, and the normal experience here is that somebody will come and drag me off if I don't leave. So is this correct? It's terribly sad. I'm very sorry for not. Just 1 minute. What I take away, I don't know whether this helps you. I take away that you would, those of you who were wise enough to stay and listen, as Mark Carney said, were wise because they will have taken away from this that the view that this is all over is a very, very serious error. And the monetary policy settings in particular, the fiscal positions to a secondary degree, and the sort of discussion we're having about monetary policy and that we've had here shows that in a very big way. That's the first point. Second, some of us would say, that's a big argument, that we have over-relied somewhat on monetary policy, with real questions about what we've been doing in other areas. And that's, I think, come out very well. There's a particularly continued concern about the failure to get, I think, escape velocity, somebody used this terminology, for the developed countries in general, the Eurozone in particular, and a very long struggle still to restore stability and balance within the Eurozone. It's very, very far from complete. And we did have a discussion of US fiscal policy, and as of course everybody knows here, there's supposed to be a budget agreed fairly soon, and that hasn't existed for a while. So we have to see what that budget is going to look like, and it seems to me, don't really know. So the amount of uncertainty out there is enough to keep the hedge fund participants in this audience very happy, alas, for quite a while. The good side of this is we didn't go over the various cliffs we were worried about a year ago, and there were enough of them around. That's really something. We seem to have an extraordinary capacity to save ourselves from imminent catastrophe. I wish we could do something more positive in the long run, but our capacity to survive imminent catastrophe has been proved to be quite impressive. Also proved to be quite impressive, more than quite impressive, is the staggering capacity of China to continue to grow rapidly, increasingly internally driven. The decline in the current account surplus is quite remarkable, and I wish a few other countries would follow this example. We obviously, the whole world wishes China every success in the massive rebalancing and growth, which is going to transform the world, I think, over the next decade. And finally, I would stress the really, on balance, very good and positive news we got out of Africa, and also stress Trevor Manuel's point, which is, in essence, we are in one world, and we do rely on you to do sensible things because they matter for us. And I would say that, on the whole, the developed countries have not shown themselves over the last decade quite as impressive as one might have expected, except for this incredible capacity to avoid actually going over the cliff, which we should congratulate them or ourselves on. With that, I think that more or less is what I've taken away from the discussion. I hope you've enjoyed it. I have. And now you can all go skiing.